Today, the BBC has come out with a article, Child Sexual Exploitation: How the System Failed. The entire article is about victims of grooming gangs throughout the UK, and I'm going to read the whole thing because I think it's important to listen to. Grooming, rape, trafficking, or the many other ways children are being sexually abused, the subject of child exploitation, or CSE, as it is known by professionals in the field, is in the headlines with depressing regularity. Telford is currently in the spotlight, but it is by no means the first place, and it will not be the last. There were so many opportunities in Rotherham, in Rochdale, in Oxford, to step in and help. No one did. The exploitation continued. Not only did the cycle of abuse grind on, but the message given to victims must have been that we don't care about you. One 13-year-old girl with disrupted clothing was found by police in a house in the early hours with a group of men who had given her vodka. A neighbour had called the police after hearing the girl scream. The teenager was arrested for being drunk and disorderly. The men were not questioned. A 12-year-old girl was found being plied with alcohol in a car with a 22-year-old man. He had indecent images of her on his phone. No action was taken. Rather than being offered protection, teenagers groomed and coerced into having sex faced criminal charges of prostitution. A major factor was the public and professional perception of the abused girls, who were often dismissed as troublemakers. As the Children's Society 1995 Games Up report asked, is it acceptable that a child abused at a home is protected, whereas a child abused on the street is criminalised? And the media unwittingly helped to obscure the scale of the abuse, referring to the children as the girlfriends of adult men. When in 2001, Lucy Lowe was murdered in Telford, along with her mother and sister, by the 26-year-old man who had groomed and abused her, news outlets, including the BBC, described the adult killer as Lucy's boyfriend. She was 16 and pregnant with her second child by Azhar Ali Mahmood, who set fire to the Lowe family home. The infant was also in the house. In court, the prosecution barrister Adrian Redgrave QC said, there had also been occasions where he had been, in one way or another, humiliated in front of others by things that Lucy had said or done. He was jealous and possessive. The court heard that they had a stormy relationship and argued frequently, sometimes about her relationships with other men. It makes for difficult reading. At no point is a suggestion made that this was not a relationship and that Lucy was a victim of rape. Targeted by Mahmood, aged 12, and given birth to her first child at 14, she was legally incapable of consent. It later emerged that Lucy's situation was far from usual. Operation Chalice, launched by the West Mercia police, led to the jailing of a group of Asian men, mostly of Pakistani origin, whom police said may have targeted more than 100 girls. Even 5 years ago, people were talking about the lifestyle choices of these young people were making, said Adele Gladman, the Home Office researcher who reported the scale of abuse in Rotherham. As recently as 2012, when 24-year-old Adel Harley was convicted of raping a 13-year-old girl and jailed for 18 years, his barrister asked the judge to be lenient because this type of rape is not like other horrible types of rape. It is now astonishing, but lawyer Tayab Khan stood up in court and said the child had loved Ali, who had been pleasant to her, and it had been a consensual relationship, a message both damaging and dangerous. But the language used to describe young people in abusive situations is slowly changing. A significant factor was the abolishment of the term child prostitution in favour of the term child sexual exploitation, first used in 2009 in the Department of Education document. A small change perhaps, but it shifted the focus and clarification that children were involved were victims, not perpetrators, of the crime. According to research carried out by Barnardo's, describing victims as a girlfriend or boyfriend can make it more difficult for them to realise that they are in an abusive situation. The J report cites cases in which abusers targeted children when they knew there was a chance that the victim might be especially vulnerable. such as those living in local authority residential units and who have a desperate need for attention and affection. Those in local authorities care and are often deliberately targeted for exploitation as they may not have the same support in their lives, with adults who can spot that they are at risk. The Barnardo's research indicates perpetrators of this type of CSE will particularly draw on children's feelings of loneliness, their need for care, and their desire to be loved. A girl starved of attention and kindness is more likely to believe she is in a caring relationship, leaving the perpetrator free to coerce her to have sex with friends or associates. As a result, children will often protect their perpetrator, even when they recognise their behaviour as exploitative and abusive. "I know he loves me. He has other girlfriends, but I'm special," was a sentiment often uttered in investigation into what happened in Rotherham. Many victims do not want to cooperate with the criminal justice system. A care worker who was employed at children's homes from 2003 to 2007 spoke anonymously to the BBC in 2014. He said men would arrive almost every night to collect girls, who escaped using a range of methods and were then usually driven off in taxis. Children who have been abused do not blame their attacker simply because they are struggling for love, but you cannot provide love in a children's unit. It's one thing that you can't provide, and as a corporate parent, it's where we fail. And if the abusers are providing that, plus drugs and alcohol and freedoms, or perceived freedoms, then we're never going to be able to keep them safe. Dr. Helen Beckett, director at the University of Bedfordshire's Centre of Researching CSE, says, "What is common across all forms of CSE is the rarity with which young people disclose what is happening to them. There are many different reasons for this. Many young people don't even realise the abusive nature of what is happening. Some may even feel in some way complicit in the abuse because there have been some kind of reward or receipt of something. This can be gifts, alcohol, drugs, or affection. In some cases, victims are so traumatized they use drink or drugs to cope, but then need the means to get the drink or drugs. It's a vicious circle." Ms. Gladman said this is one area in which nothing has changed. "The grooming is so good, so targeted and tailored that the girls and boys involved don't understand they are being exploited. They don't listen to warnings, they're desperate for love and attention, and it's up to the experts to recognise that, to spot who is vulnerable, and almost follow the grooming process themselves. We have to engage with the young people and make them feel worthwhile, giving them life skills. There is, however, a danger to thinking the only people at risk are those with difficult histories. As Ms. Gladman points out, parents tend to believe it's kids from troubled families who are at risk. Any child can be vulnerable if not protected." While some of the most high-profile cases of CSE have involved gangs of men with Pakistani heritage abusing white girls, Dr. Beckett points out that there is no typical case of CSE. It exists across every ethnic grouping, both in terms of those perpetrating and in terms of those experiencing the abuse. Research tells us that both males and females are abused through CSE. Similarly, both males and females perpetrate the abuse. Whilst most of our focus historically has been on adults abusing children, we are increasingly learning about peer-on-peer abuse and the risk that young people face within their social settings. One example is that of Laura Wilson, a 17-year-old murdered by Ashtiaq Asghar, also 17, in Rotherham in 2010. He stabbed her multiple times and pushed her into the canal to die. Once again, the press described the killer as her boyfriend, but at the same time as reporting that Laura had a 4-month-old daughter with Asghar's friend, and that they treated white girls as sexual targets and not like human beings. Peter Grigg from the Children's Society says there has been a gradual change in attitudes towards the nature of exploitation, and the exposure of the abuse in Rotherham, Rochdale and other places has certainly ensured decision makers and the public pay attention to issues. But how is the issue tackled? Everybody involved in child protection agrees that there is no single solution. No one agency holds the answer. According to the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, systematic grooming and sexual abuse of children by groups of offenders in cities and towns of England and Wales is widespread. Adele Gladman says that over the past 12 years in which she has been working in the field, there is no geographical location where it is not a problem. Peter Griggs says it's very likely that many other victims exist, haven't yet felt able to speak out. The charity's Old Enough to Know Better report shows that 50,000 females aged 16 and 17 experienced sexual offences against them, but only around 5,000 of them were reported to the police. The actual figures are impossible to accurately predict, says Cassie Harrison, director of the Centre of Expertise on Child Sexual Abuse. Due to data limitations, we are making decisions in a fog. We just can't say if more children are being sexually abused. We know we are identifying more of it, but this is the tip of the iceberg. Reported numbers are increasing, but that could be because of increasing willingness of victims to report links to confidence that they will be taken seriously, increased professional awareness of signs of abuse and commitment to take action, or because recording has improved. Nobody asked questions. Holly, not her real name, was a victim of a group of men in Telford. She told the BBC what happened to her. He started violently raping me. He would beat me with his belt if I didn't let him rape me. Afterwards, he would try to make me feel better, or make himself feel better, by giving me money or topping up my mobile phone. It quickly moved on to being sold to men maybe 2 or 3 times a night. I was taken to a place I can only describe as a rape house, which was set up for the purpose of young girls to be sold to men. The reason I kept going back was that they kept threatening me with burning my house down, which was a real threat in Telford, as they had actually happened previously. They said they'd rape my mum and might rape my sisters. They knew all about my family. There was just no escape at all. I was gang raped. Just after I turned 16, that was probably the worst thing that had ever happened to me. After that, I tried to commit suicide. People would say to me, "What's that? Was that a cry for help?" And I would say no. I genuinely wanted to die, because I thought it was the only way out. I was in cars that were stopped and searched by police with older men, and it was never questioned why I was in there or who I was. My name was never asked. I just think if they had been more proactive at this point like that, things could have changed earlier. I was always going to the doctor with youth sexual health clinic a couple of times a week for 3 years and getting the morning after pill. Nobody asked questions. I had 2 abortions, and again, no questions were asked as to what was going on in my life. Identifying at-risk children is done by various organisations, charities, social workers, and police. All have child welfare personnel who are on the streets at night. Outreach sessions are held in parks and other areas popular with children. Some children are already in contact with social services, for example those who are in local authority care. Workers use methods including regular texting, calls and cards, as well as by arranging to meet on the young person's home ground, or at venues where they feel comfortable. Ms. Gladman, now an independent safeguarding children trainer and consultant, says legalisation has been made more sophisticated in order to deal with the impact of grooming, and importantly, every local authority now has protocol to identify and prevent CSE. We've become more aware of the abuse and better at spotting it. In some ways, we've made huge strides. We're reaching out to the parents and communities. We're engaged with what's called the nighttime economy, taxi drivers, takeaways, off licenses, places like that. Staff at such premises have proved a valuable, if unofficial, resource when it comes to safeguarding children. Last year, taxi driver Satbir Aurora raised the alarm after he drove a teenager alone to a railway station. Often people let their guard down when they're out and about or in shops. Children talk to each other, and they may be overheard by a shopkeeper who can get in touch with the police about what they suspect, says Ms. Gladman. Cassie Harris agrees public awareness is changing for the better. Over the past few years, we've seen an increased understanding of CSE, the complexity of the relationships between the abuser and the victim, and the way the abuser can control and manipulate the victim. Our ambition should be to prevent abuse before it happens, not wait until a child has been abused. There are many ways we can do this. For example, we should support young people to have expectations of healthy relationships and provide support for children when they display harmful sexual behaviour. It is never the responsibility of a child to keep themselves safe, and blame lies with the perpetrator. As adults, it is our responsibility to spot the signs and take action to safeguard children, not rely on children to tell us they are being abused. Well, if you managed to get through that without becoming somewhat emotional, that is impressive. But this is the problem. It seems that most times the perpetrator is mentioned, and their ethnicities mentioned, they're mostly, let's say, Pakistani. And that's common across most reported cases of this when they actually do get reported, because this has taken the BBC 3 days to talk about. And a lot of the men have very, well, they're not exactly Anglo-Saxon English names when they're mentioned, and it's possibly a bit of a problem. And it's eventually made Jess Phillips, of all people, the MP for Birmingham, who wants to censor the internet, ask how many Telfords before we get serious about child grooming. Well, I don't know, but let's hear your thoughts. Some time ago, I was sitting in the Sunday school room of a local church, with posters made by kids depicting the teachers of Jesus curling at the corners on the walls. I was there to do my advice surgery in my role as the local counsellor. A man came in to ask for help getting his family moved to a bigger house. His daughter had 2 children who had been removed from her care but were allowed to live with her on the condition that she lived with her parents and they acted as guardians. I diligently took down the names and ages of the children to assess the size of the house they needed. He told me his daughter was 20, her children were 6 and 2. It didn't take a maths genius to work out she had been 14 when she had her firstborn child. He explained that his daughter had struggled with mental health problems and had mild learning difficulties. I asked where the father of her children was. One was a Pakistani fellow with a wife and kids, and they weren't sure who the father of the littlest was. I am trained in the issue of sexual exploitation, so instead of seeing the father of a wayward woman who had made bad choices, I looked up from my notepad and said, I think I need to see your daughter. I'm worried she has been exploited. I explained what I thought, and he told me his daughter said the men she had slept with were her boyfriends. My heart sank, not because it was so awful. I'd heard lots of similar stories in my time working at a rape crisis centre. My heart hurt because I thought of all the social workers she had seen. She had, after all, had her children removed from her. She had given birth twice, seen many medics, no doubt been at school, seen her GP. No one spoke up. I asked if they had ever contacted the police. He told me the only interaction was when she had been in trouble herself. No one had ever seen her as a vulnerable child. She was just a naughty girl, a bad mum, a fallen woman. This week's revelation that in Telford, a small industrial town, sexual exploitation had been occurring on a mass scale, with hundreds of vulnerable girls potentially affected, is utterly maddening in its familiarity. This is Groundhog Day. Rotherham, Oxford, Rochdale, Telford, they tip off the tongue like a nursery rhyme about a plague. Give it 6 months and we'll have another town to add to our grooming ring of roses. I'm with Lucy Allen, Telford's MP, who is pressing the government for an independent investigation into grooming the town. Damn right. Hitching these incidents to the child sex abuse inquiry does nothing to understand the specifics that led to exploitation on this scale. Time was that the government funded 15 areas in the UK to set up supportive services for sexual exploitation. It was linked to the gangs violence agenda that sprang from the riots of 2011. That's gone now, and even so, linking those 3 things was always naive. Yet sexual exploitation in gangs. Yes, sexual exploitation is mostly commonly committed by peers, but generalising about the problem is a political shrug and it changes nothing. We need to understand. We need to create a vehicle to tackle the specific nature of grooming gangs. Every police force and every children's service in the country needs a specialist team that only works on this subject, and the government has yet to pay for it. It must also fund specialist victim and youth services that can win trust among difficult to reach groups, who in my experience are not difficult to reach if any other people didn't find them so difficult to look at. These teams need to work on prevention as much as on prosecution, offering intensive work with vulnerable groups of girls, those in care with special needs, mental health problems and other difficulties. Police teams should be doing outreach work with the communities identified in every case. I live in one of those communities, and I know they want things done. We must find a way to talk about the stuff, break all the culture of silence, and change the story. Telford is not the end, it's barely even the middle. How many more scandals will it take that are so large we name the town, not the victims? My guess is that it will take more than it should, and then we all fall down. Not a bad article all in all. But I think Jess Phillips, unfortunately, this is going to be my only opinion that I give off in this video, because this is way too serious and way too upsetting to make any proper jokes over. But I think we're going to get serious about child grooming when it's done by a group of white men. And I'm serious about that. I think the police are too worried about being called racist. I think there's too much social pressure on the police and services to not be racist. It's why I absolutely despise the idea of social pressure. I don't like it. Just apply the law equally. These men have done the worst things that I've ever been aware of in real life. In my country, anyway. Burning down the home of a 16-year-old who's pregnant. Probably because she spoke up. Fund an independent body for this. I don't know. Get these people in jail. And if they're, to be honest, if they're not British citizens, deport them. They have another home they can go to. See how well grooming gangs go down there. Well, in the meantime, thank you for listening, and goodbye.